The Servile Wars, the revolt that shook Rome, the cracks in Rome's might. The Roman Republic stood as the dominant power in the Mediterranean following its final victory over Carthage in 146 BC. But even as external threats waned, internal strife brewed beneath the surface. Rome's economy, politics, and society were deeply entangled with slavery, a system that fueled both its prosperity and its greatest fears. The result: a series of violent uprisings known as the Servile Wars, culminating in the legendary Spartacus rebellion. These wars weren't just about slaves rebelling, they were symptomatic of a republic that was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. This is the story of the Servile Wars, the first of which erupted in Sicily in 135 BC. But this isn't just a tale of battles and bloodshed, it's a deeper exploration of Rome's internal weaknesses, its failure to manage its growing empire, and the men who defied one of the most powerful civilizations in history. The roots of rebellion: Rome's slave economy, slavery as Rome's backbone. By the 2nd century BC, Rome's expansionist policies have flooded the Republic with slaves. Conquered peoples, particularly from Carthage, Greece, and the East, were sold into servitude by the tens of thousands. These slaves were not just household servants. They were the lifeblood of Rome's massive agricultural estates known as latifundia. Run by wealthy Roman elites, these estates operated on brutal efficiency, minimal sustenance, maximum labor. But this economic model had a flaw. The sheer volume of slaves meant that mistreatment was widespread. With no legal protection, slaves were seen as property, their lives expendable. Many toiled in the countryside under appalling conditions, while others served in the homes of the elite, enduring humiliation and abuse. This created a volatile situation, one that would soon explode into outright war. A ticking time bomb. Sicily, Rome's first overseas province, became a breeding ground for discontent. Once a thriving Greek and Carthaginian stronghold, it had been transformed into a vast plantation economy by Roman investors. These landowners, seeking maximum profits, pushed their slaves to the breaking point. When food was scarce, slaves resorted to banditry, attacking travelers, raiding storehouses, and forming underground networks of resistance. Rome, distracted by external conflicts, paid little attention to man who would be king. In 135 BC, a slave named Eunice emerged as an unlikely leader. Originally from Syria, he was known for his supposed prophetic visions and fire-breathing performances. His master, Antigenes, treated his claims of kingship as a joke, parading him at banquets for entertainment. But to the enslaved population, Eunice's words carried hope. His vision spoke of a world where they were free, where the masters would be overthrown, and justice would reign. The tipping point came when a group of 400 slaves in the city of Anna decided they had had enough. They turned to Eunice for guidance, and with his support, they launched a rebellion. Armed with whatever they could find, farm tools, kitchen knives, and stolen weapons, they stormed the homes of their Roman oppressors, slaughtering their masters and setting the city ablaze. The First Servile War, 135–132 BC, Rome's first wake-up call. A slave army rises. What began as a localized revolt quickly spiraled into a full-scale war. The rebellion spread across the island, drawing tens of thousands of slaves into its ranks. Eunice, now styling himself as King Antiochus, led a force that swelled to over 70,000. His right-hand man, Cleon, a former brigand from Asia Minor, proved to be a brilliant military strategist, giving the rebellion an edge against the Romans. Roman response: underestimating the enemy. Initially, Rome dismissed the revolt as nothing more than a minor uprising. The Senate sent small contingents of troops, believing that untrained slaves could never pose a serious threat. But Eunice and Cleon's forces crushed these initial expeditions, demonstrating that the rebellion was far more formidable than expected. By the time Rome recognized the severity of the situation, the rebels had captured key cities, minted their own coins, and effectively ruled much of Sicily. The Republic now faced a dilemma. This was no mere riot. It was an existential crisis. The turning point: Rome strikes back. By 132 BC, the Senate had had enough. It dispatched the consul Publius Rupilius with a seasoned Roman army. Unlike his predecessors, Rupilius came prepared for a prolonged campaign. He besieged rebel strongholds, systematically starving them out. The city of Tauromenium fell first, its defenders resorting to cannibalism before a final, desperate attempt to break the siege. When the city was taken, the Romans executed the surviving rebels en masse. The final showdown came at Enna, the heart of the rebellion. Cleon led a suicidal charge against the Romans, preferring to die in battle rather than face capture. He was slain, his body displayed as a warning to the remaining rebels. Eunice, realizing all was lost, fled into the mountains with a handful of followers. One by one, they took their own lives to avoid Roman retribution. Eunice was captured but died in prison before he could be executed. The First Servile War was over, but it was only the beginning. Lessons unlearned. The Second Servile War 104 to 100 BC. Rome's mistakes. Despite its victory, Rome failed to address the root causes of the revolt. Slavery remained as brutal as ever, and in just 3 decades, Sicily erupted into rebellion again. This time, it was led by another prophetic leader, Soloeus, who, like Eunice, claimed divine visions. Taking the name King Tryphon, he rallied over 20,000 slaves and waged war against Rome. Athenian, the warrior king. While Soloeus led in the east, another leader, Athenian, rose in the west. Unlike Soloeus, Athenian was not just a visionary, but a battle-hardened warrior. He transformed his army into a disciplined force, picking only the strongest slaves to fight and rejecting those he deemed weak. This level of organization made the rebellion even more dangerous than the first. Rome's counterattack, a war of attrition. The war dragged on for years, with Rome struggling to subdue the insurgents. Finally, in 101 BC, the Senate sent Manius Aquilius, a seasoned general, to end the conflict. He crushed Soloeus' forces and then hunted down Athenian, who fell in battle after wounding Aquilius himself. Rome had won again, but at great cost. The slave revolts were becoming larger, more coordinated, and more difficult to suppress. And the worst was yet to come. The shadow of Spartacus. The first 10 Second Servile Wars are but prequels to the greatest slave uprising of them all, the rebellion of Spartacus in 73 BC. Rome had barely survived the first 2, but Spartacus would push the Republic to its breaking point. Why did these revolts happen in the first place? Was it simply cruelty, or was it a symptom of a deeper problem within Rome? The truth is, these wars were warning signs of an empire that was beginning to fracture, long before its eventual fall. The rise of Spartacus, a gladiator's rebellion begins. A storm brewing in the shadows of Rome. Rome, in the early 1st century BC, stood as the unrivaled master of the Mediterranean, a colossus draped in marble and steel. Its legions had crushed Carthage, subjugated Greece, and turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. Yet, beneath the polished facade of imperial might, a storm was gathering in the unlikeliest of places, a gladiator school in Capua. This was a time of wealth and decadence, but also of deepening inequality. While senators feasted on exotic delicacies from the far reaches of the Republic, the streets and countryside of Italy were overflowing with men and women who had been stripped of everything: their freedom, their homes, even their names. They were Rome's slaves, the invisible hands that built her monuments, worked her fields, and entertained her citizens in bloody spectacles. And among them was one man who would shake the empire to its core: Spartacus. This is not just a story of rebellion, it is the story of a desperate struggle for freedom, of a man who turned from a warrior of Rome to its greatest enemy. It is a tale of strategy, betrayal, and brutal warfare that would bring the Republic to its knees. The making of a gladiator. Who was Spartacus? The enigmatic origins of Spartacus. Much of Spartacus' early life is shrouded in mystery, and historians continue to debate his true origins. The ancient sources, primarily Plutarch and Appian, agree on one key fact: he was a Thracian. Thrace, located in what is now modern-day Bulgaria and parts of Turkey and Greece, was a land of fierce warriors and shifting allegiances. Some accounts suggest that Spartacus may have been a mercenary or even an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army before he was enslaved. If true, this would explain his later tactical brilliance on the battlefield. Others argue that he was a noble warrior of the Mede tribe, a people known for their resistance against Rome. Regardless of his background, one thing is certain: Spartacus was no ordinary slave. Rome had long used its gladiator schools to turn captives into entertainment. The Ludus of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua was one such institution, a place where men were trained to fight and die for the amusement of the masses. Here, Spartacus was sent, forced to wield a gladius not for honor or victory, but for the pleasure of the Roman elite. That, unlike the countless others before him, Spartacus would not resign himself to this fate. The spark of rebellion. The Great Escape. A plan for freedom. Life in a gladiator school was brutal. The men trained day and night, their bodies hardened into weapons, but their minds were shackled by the ever-present threat of the whip and the sword. However, something was different about this group of captives. Among them were men who had once been warriors, soldiers, and rebels in their own lands. There were Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and Greeks, fierce fighters who had only been captured due to bad luck or treachery. They had not forgotten the taste of freedom, and Spartacus, with his natural charisma and intelligence, became their leader. A plan was hatched in secret to escape. The initial plan called for nearly 200 gladiators to break out at once. However, word of the conspiracy leaked, and the school's guards moved to suppress it. But Spartacus and about 70 men acted swiftly, overpowering their captors before they could react. Arming themselves with kitchen knives, wooden clubs, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find, they broke free and stormed the armory, seizing real weapons, glaive, shields, and armor. Now, they were not just escaped slaves, they were a trained force, and they were out for vengeance. Taking the fight to Rome, after escaping the ludus, Spartacus and his men fled into the countryside of Campania. But unlike other runaway slaves, they did not simply scatter. They regrouped, they planned, and most importantly, they struck back. Their first major victory came when a small force sent by the local authorities was ambushed and annihilated. With each Roman soldier they killed, they gained more weapons, more armor, and more confidence. Word spread like wildfire. Spartacus had defied Rome. Slaves from the surrounding farms began to flock to his banner. These were not trained warriors, but desperate men and women who saw in Spartacus a chance at something they had never dreamed possible: freedom. Rome responds, underestimating the threat. The Senate's arrogance. At first, Rome did not take the rebellion seriously. Slave uprisings had happened before, and they had always been crushed quickly. The Senate sent a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with 3,000 men to put an end to the revolt. Glaber was no great general. He assumed that Spartacus was just a desperate fugitive and that his band of rebels would crumble at the sight of a disciplined Roman force. Instead of engaging them in battle, he decided to blockade them on Mount Vesuvius, cutting off their escape. It was a critical mistake. Spartacus' tactical genius. Rather than sitting and waiting for starvation to set in, Spartacus devised a daring plan. Using vines and wooden ladders, he and his men climbed down the sheer cliffs of the mountain under the cover of darkness. Then, in a stunning reversal, they flanked the Romans, catching them completely off guard. The result was a massacre. Glaber's forces, expecting an easy victory, were cut down in the dead of night. Those who survived fled in terror. Spartacus had not just won, he had humiliated Rome. The rebellion grows, a movement of the oppressed, a symbol of hope. Spartacus' victory at Vesuvius changed everything. What had begun as a small band of escapees was now a full-fledged rebellion. Thousands of slaves across Italy began to rise up, inspired by the news that one of their own had dared to challenge Rome and lived. His army swelled to over 70,000 men, and with each battle, his forces became more disciplined. They were no longer just an angry mob, they were an army. Divisions within the rebels. However, not all of Spartacus' men shared the same vision. His second-in-command, Crixus, a fierce Gallic warrior, believed that they should stay in Italy, raiding and plundering as they went. Spartacus, on the other hand, had a different dream. He wanted to lead his people north, through the Alps, to freedom. This division would ultimately cost the rebellion dearly. But for now, Spartacus stood at the height of his power. Rome begins to fear Spartacus. Spartacus had defied the odds, humiliating Rome's legions and uniting thousands under his banner. The Senate, once dismissive of the rebellion, now realized the full extent of the threat. No longer would they send second-rate commanders with small forces. They would now send their best. As Rome prepared to unleash its full fury, Spartacus and his men stood on the precipice of history. The greatest battles were yet to come. Spartacus unleashed war against the Roman legions. The empire trembles. By the year 70 to BC, Rome was no longer laughing at Spartacus. What had started as a minor slave uprising in Capua had transformed into a military crisis of unprecedented scale. Spartacus and his army had shattered Roman forces in battle after battle, proving that the legions were not invincible. His army had grown to over 120,000 men, a force so massive that it shook the very foundations of the Republic. The Senate was finally beginning to grasp the severity of the situation. They had underestimated Spartacus once, and it had cost them dearly. Now, they would send their best, their strongest, and their most ruthless generals to crush him. What followed was a brutal, bloody war, one that would test the limits of Spartacus' tactical genius and reveal the fractures within his growing rebellion. Rome strikes back. The consuls take the field. To political pressure to end the rebellion. Rome was a republic built on hierarchy, reputation, and political ambition. Every senator and general sought personal glory, and the failure of the praetors in 73 BC to suppress Spartacus had created a stain on Rome's military honor. In response, the Senate decided that the rebellion was no longer a mere policing issue, it was a war, and wars required consuls, the highest-ranking officials in the republic. For the year 72 BC, the Senate assigned both consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, to lead to massive consular armies, each numbering around 20,000 men. The message was clear. Spartacus had to be crushed, no matter the cost. The division between Spartacus and Crixus, but inside the rebel camp, there was division. Not everyone agreed on what the next move should be. Spartacus wanted to lead his army north, to cross the Alps and escape Roman territory. He understood that while his army was strong, it lacked the infrastructure, siege weapons, and supplies to sustain a prolonged war. His dream was not to conquer Rome but to lead his people to safety. But his Gallic second-in-command, Crixus, had a different vision. He saw the rebellion as an opportunity not just to escape, but to burn Rome to the ground. He and many of his followers wanted to stay in Italy, pillage the rich cities, and make the Romans suffer for their cruelty. This fundamental disagreement split the army. 30,000 men followed Crixus, while Spartacus took the majority of the force north. This division would prove to be a fatal mistake. The fall of Crixus, a bitter lesson. The Battle of Mount Garganus. The consuls, seeing the split in the rebel army, decided to attack Crixus first. His smaller force was an easier target, and eliminating him would weaken Spartacus' overall strength. At Mount Garganus, Gellius Publicola led his army against Crixus' force. Without the strategic genius of Spartacus, the Gallic army fought bravely but without discipline. The Romans, experienced in large-scale combat, methodically broke Crixus' forces apart. By the end of the battle, 20,000 rebels lay dead, including Crixus himself. The Romans showed no mercy. Spartacus' revenge. When news of Crixus' death reached Spartacus, he was enraged. Though they had disagreed, Crixus was still his brother in arms. Spartacus vowed vengeance. Instead of continuing north, he turned his army around and hunted down Publicola's forces. Spartacus ambushed the Roman army and slaughtered them in a decisive victory. To honor Crixus, he ordered that 300 Roman captives be forced to fight to the death, gladiator-style, a cruel irony, as this was the same fate Rome had inflicted on thousands of slaves. The victory was a testament to Spartacus' leadership, but it had cost him precious time. Rome was still coming for him. Spartacus' Great Northern March. Defeating the consuls again. As Spartacus resumed his march north, the second consul, Lentulus Clodianus, blocked his path. The plan was clear: trap Spartacus between two armies. But Spartacus was faster. Before Lentulus could coordinate with Publicola, Spartacus attacked and crushed his army. Now, both consuls had been defeated, an unprecedented humiliation for Rome. Spartacus continued north, aiming for the Alps, but something unexpected happened. A critical decision. Why didn't Spartacus escape? Historians have long debated why Spartacus, despite winning battle after battle, did not cross the Alps and leave Italy when he had the chance. Some theories include: 1. His army didn't want to leave. Many of Spartacus' men were not Thracians like him. They were Gauls, Germans, and other groups who wanted to keep fighting Rome rather than flee. 2. Logistical challenges. Crossing the Alps with an army of 100,000 people, including women and children, was a logistical nightmare. There were no supply chains, and the winter snows made the journey dangerous. 3. A change in strategy. Some argue that Spartacus had begun to believe Rome could actually be defeated. His army had beaten every force sent against it. Why run when they could fight? Whatever the reason, Spartacus turned his army around and headed south again. This decision would change the course of history. Rome's last gamble. The rise of Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus takes command. By now, Rome was in full panic mode. They had exhausted their options. The consuls had failed. The Senate needed a commander who could do what others could not. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, an ambitious aristocrat who saw in this crisis a chance to make himself a legend. He volunteered to take full command and personally funded 6 new legions with his vast fortune. Unlike previous commanders, Crassus was ruthless. He understood that the problem was not just Spartacus, but the cowardice of the Roman soldiers. They had been humiliated too many times. Crassus needed to make them fear him more than they feared Spartacus. The revival of decimation. Crassus revived one of Rome's most brutal punishments, decimation. After an early defeat by Spartacus, he forced his own soldiers to kill 1 in every 10 men in their ranks. This had 2 effects. It restored discipline. The men would rather die fighting than face Crassus' wrath. It terrified Rome's enemies. No one had seen this level of brutality before. Crassus' strategic genius. Unlike previous commanders, Crassus did not chase Spartacus recklessly. Instead, he used fortifications to trap the rebels. He built a 37-mile-long trench across southern Italy, cutting Spartacus off from Sicily and any potential reinforcements. Spartacus knew he was running out of options. He tried to buy passage to Sicily from pirates, hoping to restart the rebellion on the island. But the pirates betrayed him. With no other choice, Spartacus prepared for one final battle, the beginning of the end. Spartacus had spent 2 years defying the greatest empire in the world. He had humiliated Rome's consuls, crushed legions, and led an army of former slaves to victories no one thought possible. But now, he faced his greatest challenge yet, a disciplined army under a brilliant and ruthless commander. The final showdown was near. Would Spartacus achieve the impossible, or would Rome finally bring him to his knees? The final stand of Spartacus, or rebellion's last breath. The Noose Titans. For 2 years, Spartacus had defied Rome in ways no one thought possible. He had shattered legions, outmaneuvered Rome's greatest generals, and led an army of slaves to victories that shook the very foundations of the Republic. He had humiliated consuls, rooted disciplined legions, and turned the Roman war machine into a laughingstock. But now, the tide was turning. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a ruthless and brilliant commander, had taken charge of the war. Unlike the generals before him, he understood that Spartacus was no ordinary enemy. He did not chase the rebel leader recklessly. Instead, he built fortifications, cut off supplies, and forced Spartacus into a corner. Trapped in the south of Italy, with no way forward and no hope of escape, Spartacus was left with one final choice: fight or die. This is the story of the final days of Spartacus, a man who stood against the might of Rome and refused to kneel. Crassus' War of Attrition, the Wall of Death, a masterstroke of strategy. Unlike previous Roman commanders, Crassus did not rely on brute force alone. Instead, he used engineering and strategy to suffocate Spartacus' rebellion. His masterstroke came in the form of a 37-mile-long trench and fortification wall, stretching from coast to coast in southern Italy. This effectively cut Spartacus off from any route to escape. Why was this so brilliant? It starved Spartacus' army. The rebels relied on raiding for supplies. Now, they were cut off from the fertile lands of Italy and forced to survive on dwindling resources. It broke their morale. Many of Spartacus' men had joined for the promise of freedom. Now, that dream was dying with every passing day. It forced Spartacus to act. With time against him, Spartacus had to make a desperate move, a desperate escape. Spartacus was no fool. He knew that staying trapped behind Crassus' fortifications meant a slow and painful death. His only hope was to break through the lines. One night, as a fierce snowstorm raged, Spartacus struck. He and his warriors piled dirt, wood, and bodies into the trench, creating a crossing point. Then, under the cover of darkness, he led his men in a desperate charge, hoping to shatter Crassus' defenses. It almost worked. The rebels overwhelmed part of the Roman fortifications, breaking through the line and escaping north. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of Spartacus' men were killed in the assault, and those who made it through were starving and exhausted. The rebellion was running out of time. The betrayal of Spartacus. The Sicilian gamble. A fatal mistake. Spartacus, ever the strategist, saw one last opportunity: Sicily. Sicily had been the site of two massive slave revolts before, and Spartacus hoped to rekindle the flames of rebellion there. If he could ferry his army across the sea, they could start anew, gathering allies and supplies. He paid Cilician pirates to transport his forces to the island. But at the last moment, the pirates betrayed him, taking his gold, then abandoning him. With no way to escape, Spartacus knew his fate was sealed. Fractures in the rebel army. By now, the once united rebellion was crumbling from within. Many of Spartacus' men were tired of fighting. They had dreamed of freedom, not endless war. Others blamed Spartacus for their failures. Why had he not taken them over the Alps when he had the chance? Some rebel leaders, Canicus and Castus, even broke away, taking thousands of men with them. Crassus seized the opportunity. He hunted down the breakaway force, crushing them in battle and butchering 12,000 men. Spartacus now had only one option left to fight: the last stand at the Silurius River. The final battle begins. With 50,000 men left, Spartacus marched to meet Crassus one last time. Crassus, knowing that Pompey's army was on its way from Spain, wanted to claim the victory before his rival arrived. He forced the final battle near the Silurius River in Campania. As the two armies faced each other, Spartacus knew this would be the end. Spartacus' defiant stand. Before the battle, Spartacus made a bold gesture. He killed his own horse in front of his men, saying, "If we win, I shall have all the horses I need. If we lose, I shall not need one." This was his final message to his men. There would be no retreat, no surrender, only victory or death. The battle. The clash was ferocious. Spartacus and his men, though outnumbered and exhausted, fought with desperate fury. Spartacus himself cut his way through the battlefield, slaughtering Roman centurions as he fought toward Crassus himself. But despite his courage, Rome's discipline prevailed. The rebel lines collapsed, and Spartacus was surrounded. The death of Spartacus. The exact details of Spartacus' death remain a mystery. Unlike other rebel leaders, his body was never found. Some say he died fighting to the last, surrounded by Roman soldiers. Others believe he disappeared into the chaos, perhaps dying later in exile. But what is certain is this: the rebellion was over. The aftermath. Rome's brutal revenge. Crassus' wrath. Rome had won, but Crassus wanted to send a message. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. Their bodies lined the road for miles, a grim warning to any who dared challenge Rome again. For weeks, the dying men screamed in agony, a living testament to Rome's merciless vengeance. The rise of Pompey and Crassus. The defeat of Spartacus changed Roman politics forever. Crassus claimed victory, but Pompey took credit, saying he had finished the war by mopping up the last remnants of the rebels. In 70 BC, both men were elected as consuls. Their rivalry would continue for years and eventually lead to the formation of the First Triumvirate with Julius Caesar, a political alliance that would ultimately destroy the Roman Republic. The legacy of Spartacus. Though Spartacus was defeated, his legacy endured. He became a symbol of resistance, inspiring future revolts and revolutions. His story would be told for centuries, from Roman histories to modern films and literature. Even today, his name is synonymous with the fight against oppression. Though he never lived to see freedom, his defiance against Rome became immortal. The legend lives on. Spartacus was more than a man, he was an idea. He showed the world that even the mightiest empire could be challenged. He proved that no matter how powerful the oppressor, the oppressed will always rise. And though he fell in battle, his story has never died. From ancient Rome to modern revolutions, his name still echoes through history. Because in the end, Spartacus did what few dared. He stood against Rome, and for a time, Rome trembled.